Welcome to this week's episode of the Digital Exchange. Today we are joined by Dr. Johnny Fortune to discuss owner enforcement of standards. We will be talking about how standards aren't just paperwork, they're protection. They safeguard data, operations, and long-term value, but too often they're ignored, misunderstood, or treated like optional guidelines. We will be talking about why owners have standards in the first place and what happens when they don't enforce them. Let's get it. Today, I am joined by the Dr. Johnny Fortune. Tell us who Dr. Johnny Fortune is.
The top of the list, I'm a friend of Robert Brown. First off, thanks for having me on your show, man. I really appreciate it. And longtime friend, always enjoy seeing you and talking with you. I'm sure we'll have a good time this episode. Grew up in construction, so I've been around it all my life. Over 20 years in AE firms. Volunteered for a long time on national standards and did some contract work for them, and then worked professionally in developing national standards for a while. And now my own consulting company that's focused on performance improvement, change management, standardization, process reengineering, all the things that help organizations operate better. I volunteered for a long time in developing national standards, and then I worked as a contractor for quite some time, helping develop a federal agency's standards, and then also worked as an employee, pushing things like the National BIM program and National BIM standard, National CAD standard, those type things.
We've spoke together. I mean, you more of a moderator than myself, so this is a little bit different. We also attended Penn State last year for the standardization of digital twins. I do have something I want to ask you to kind of kick this off is, what do standards actually, how do they protect owners? What are they meant for?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of times we throw the term standards around and people, forget why they exist in the first place. But they are kind of a go-to solution to address consistency issues. Right. That's why you standardize something, is that when you have a lot of inconsistency. Like if I was to go in, and help an organization today and they're struggling with consistency issues, I mean, really the first line of defense against that is standardizing your process, standardizing your formats, and making sure that you can have consistent information and consistent output. And so that's why standards exist, and then the digital age we live in, right? And it's even more and more necessary now as we delve into more emerging technologies faster than we can keep up with. For applications to be able to share information with other applications, we have to have standards. One of the ones I often go to is the standard for how, cell phones communicate, smartphones, right? And the beauty of it is when you have that standard, that underlying standard for whatever the technology is, at the end of the day, I can still pick up the phone, call you, send you a text message or a chat, and it still gets through. And it's because those devices are built on a set of standards that ensure they interoperate with each other, they communicate with each other. And so when we're talking about, the owners and why they should care about standards is they want the same thing. They want, at the end of design and construction or a reality capture, record modeling, capturing conditions, activity, whatever it is, need that information, not only in a usable format for the immediate exercise and activities, but they also need it to fit within their ecosystem, right? With all the other things that they have going on. And that's why you have to have standards.
Do you see owners not adapting to the standards they have, or do you see some hesitation of how they use the standards? How do those standards, with everything that people claim they want, how do they handle the long-term operations that they desire? Not with just design and construction, but the full ecosystems you spoke about.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think conceptually, owners are not resistant to standards at all. In my experience, they understand it's like, hey, this is really going to get us the information that we need in the right format that we can utilize it in the process, though, of designing projects and constructing projects and then managing these assets. There's there's all kind of other priorities, right? They're owners, not just of information, and that's not the extent of it. That information is for something else. Like it's for a healthcare facility, right? They have some other purpose, and so sometimes it unconsciously can take a little bit of a backseat that the standards are not, aligned with. And then there's other times that other stakeholders, service providers to owners, basically maybe they don't follow the standards. The owner thought that they did and they kind of only find out later. Or sometimes there's a discussion, about some cost increase with doing things a certain way. And sometimes owners, I think, they kind of have to make a business decision about what kind of capex and opex that they have and what they have to work with, and how can they incorporate it. I think by and large, the more sophisticated owners, the larger owners have really bought into things being standardized, at least for their own organization, not necessarily like standardized with everybody in the nation and the world, but for their own operations. And I think owners who kind of have been bitten by bad data and have had to spend a lot of resources to rework that information to fit within their system, something they can use, they tend to be a little more stringent about following the standards and the requirements that they've outlined. So I don't think there's a hesitation as much as I also, know that owners have a lot of other things to think about, right? Running their business or supplying for their customers. And a lot of owners may not necessarily be a serial builder. They're not always in a building program. Maybe every few years they're doing something. So they're not, they're not necessarily all into construction data and design data and facilities management as much as some of the other stakeholders are. And so, I think their mind's in the right place, their heart's in the right place. There's sometimes just things that get in the way of the delivery being standardized.
When somebody does adopt a standard, what do you think is the first thing that kind of breakdown of that being followed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and this is a topic really dear to me with change management and performance improvement. It's always the people aspect. It's hardly ever the technology anymore, right? We have a lot of technologies. We have so many technologies to choose from. But it's not necessarily in many cases a technology problem. It's an adoption issue. And sometimes that's just, it's just change management. Have you managed that change? Have you included people and at least them knowing what change is coming? If your people in your organization don't know that the change is coming, you've not communicated with the other stakeholders, then all of a sudden you say, here's a new mandate, here's the change, we're adopting standard X. It's really hard for people to adjust to that on the fly. And there's a natural resistance, a pushback to change. So I think it's the people side of change, the people side of technology adoption. I think it's, just really understanding you have to manage those initiatives. You have to manage your digital initiative, and that includes the standards component of it for it to be successful. And the people side of that adoption is really important.
Man, I'll tell you, this is a subject like you is near and dear to my heart because I see people who have standards and they get projects and they, kind of hurting on team resources or whatever, or having a clear vision, they just hand it off and there's no workshop, collaboration, none of that. And so, can you share some that you remember off the top of your head where you saw a lack of standards create a downstream problem or pain?
Yeah. There's been a lot of them, and a lot of them have the same theme. I guess one that's coming to mind is, a project through a federal agency that actually had another customer downstream. And, it had to do with, certain standards that the customer downstream from the design agent, from the federal agency, the customer downstream really needed a certain format, needed a certain way. They communicated those standards to the design agent. The design agent communicated those standards, out to their service providers. And realizing, with that delivery, it was not what they needed. It really exposed like how much rework would have to be done. Like it creates, so that's kind of a complex scenario where you have the service provider that, not necessarily following the standard. You've got the design agent that's kind of checking that to make sure it complies with the standard. And then you got the eventual customer that wants to use that standardized data or information. And so it actually creates a lot of work. Not following the standard in the first place in that particular example, it created more work for the people receiving, the customer. They're like, hey, we tried, we can't use this. We've spent hours like, we're sending it back, and for the design agent who was kind of in between, it created a lot of extra communication back and forth between the customer and between the service provider, and a lot of extra checking. It actually created some more detailed checking later on in the project because a little bit of the trust, was not there. And then on the actual service provider, it created a lot of extra work when they had to rework some of that information to get it in compliance with standards. But I mean, that's a common story. Even when you don't have that design agent in the middle, it's a common emerging theme frequently in the work that I've seen where, the service provider, the scanner, the modeler, the designer, maybe the contractor just doesn't fully understand how the owner or the FM group intends and plans on using the data and why it has to be a certain way to facilitate that. Most FM teams, they're not overstaffed. they have to have things very lean and efficient. And then when you introduce something that doesn't fit within their ecosystem, it can really mess up the operation. So I think it's sometimes service providers think in terms of them getting the job done and handing it over, but don't realize the importance of the information being in a usable format, dependable, that the receiver of that information can properly use it on their projects.
I know what we do on our common data environment on each project. We have a resources folder, and under that we put our full kit of parts. And that way everybody has access to that. GCs, the sub, everyone. But we go a little bit further because I don't want to just hand you a document. That's not making the project successful. We want to make sure you have the document. We want to workshop with the designers and contractors to make sure they understand how we want to do it. And we want to make sure that these smaller trade contractors understand, because a lot of people don't talk to the specialty trades when they're out just doing means and methods and trying to do things with a small company trying to make a little bit of money. You can't just hand them a document, Johnny, and go, here. You have to be able to explain, hey man, we're wanting our naming convention to be this for the models because it's part of our efforts going beyond BIM or whatever. We want to be able to point something to that name. We want our assets named the correct because they're part of our FIM system, our CMMS. So we go through those type of things, which now with all that data that we're talking about, which is, it's a lot of data that we deal with in 2026.
Yeah.
How does this incorporate data and its impact on operations? How does standards make sure that either fail or be successful?
On the surface level, there's things like formats. It's actually, even things as simple as file formats, that it's in the right format that the system can ingest it. And then inside of that file format, like diving a level deeper, is that it's coded right? It's in a database that then it's decoupled from applications. You don't have to have 10 licenses of all these different pieces of software to be able to open it and get your data. So a big concept is making sure that data is decoupled from the application. It can live outside of an application and transfer from one system to another. When we dive a little deeper, even into more meaningful things, it's not just about a whole collection of, here, Mr. Facility Manager, here's everything that we did and just take it. We're tired of looking at it. It's not that. It's more about understanding what the organization needs in terms of their assets, and then those particular assets captured in the right way, structured the right way so that it can be used downstream. And I'll give an example of how that has happened often, and it often happens with COBE, which, people typically have a love-hate relationship with COBE, but, COBE is construction, operations, building information exchange, right? And it's basically a structured format. When people don't know much about COBE and they say, oh, this is supposed to have all the information we need, they just say, give us COBE, give us everything. Well, you quickly will learn that that's way too much information for most organizations. And so they try to use it as like a catch-all, but it's really a schema that organizations who understand the data that they want, they typically trim down what they need. And so sometimes COBE will pop up under a different name. Like a federal agency might say, well, okay, we want it in this format, but we only want these 25 asset types. Like, that's it. Like, these are the things we track. These are the things we care about, not the broader set that we can't do anything with. Like it's just extra data that we have to filter through. So that's actually pretty common. I've seen it many times where that Kobe deliverable or EOMC for NAVFAC or facility data workbook for USACE. I've seen many times or many examples where someone is, an organization has taken a standard, taken a schema like Kobe and said, with the owner, sit down, what's really important, and then you get a refined list. And some organizations have such a refined list that they're like, we don't need the schema anymore. And so they communicate that to the service provider and they basically hand over that specific information. So standardization, and it requires some thinking, right? It's not just like there's no easy button. Unfortunately, there's no mental checkout available for that activity. It really requires sitting down and understanding the assets and the characteristics of those assets that's really important to the owner, and making sure that that data is delivered as expected to support their life cycle operations.
Funny story, when I first got into this, well, one of the managers in our operation and maintenance, well, Robert, since you over this BIM program, I want a Kobe. I want Kobe. When we went to visit with the CMMS team, the facility management team, it was so much less of what their system wanted to ingest. And I'm like, dude, I'm not giving you that's all that data is just nothing to your team. They don't even consider most of that as critical.
And well, and while capturing some of that data might be semi-automated, the fact is that if any owner is requiring information they don't need, there's probably some dollar signs associated with it because somebody's checking it, right? Somebody's having to say, yes, I looked at it, and yes, to the best of my knowledge, it's correct, and here it is. And so if an owner is like requiring that stuff and then they're not using it, very likely they're paying more than they need to, because you're paying somebody to collect and check that information. And if you don't use it, it's a bit of a waste.
Owners that always have capital development programs, stuff like that, that's a chain for people. They're like, hey man, I got some hours I can just charge here. They don't want it, but if the owner's not educated on it, you're just paying money. So those are some of the things that, as owners are out there saying, I want standards, which we're on our 5th iteration. And Johnny, it's not easy as people think.
No.
Because each project that we go through fully, there is something that I have to adjust our standards to.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're on 5. And we actually went and compared between our standards to the FAA BIM standards, NIBS, ISO, all a bunch of different standards out there, because I wanted to see we being fair and honest, not just to the design and to the construction, but are we truly taking into consideration what we want digitally? Are we taking into consideration the FM team? Are we taking into consideration the tenants and the concessionaires?
No.
Those are the type of things that you can't give a concessionaire the same type of standard that you would a full-out design and construction person. So that was kind of the rationale behind that comparison. And when I looked at the comparison of that, it's not that many that's that far off. It just kind of goes back to what are you going to require as your handover and all of the things that make that run. I wanted to find some failure points, and you're going to laugh about this, but that was about a 6 to 8 month. It wasn't quick.
No, I mean, you're right. It's not easy. It's not easy going to that. And I think, people that thinks it's easy is probably never tried it, right? I do hear some folks sometimes will say, well, it's easy. We just adopt the national BIM standard. Let's just adopt it as is. And, that tells me they haven't actually read the national BIM standard, or same thing for the national CAD standard, right? Once you read those documents, you realize, well, this is a baseline. Adopting means saying we're adopting the baseline and then we're building on top of it, because every organization has different needs, and there's not a national standard that just out of the box is going to work for everybody, right? It provides you a baseline, a framework, if you will, but there's a lot of pieces to fill in that fits your organization.
What type of team struggles have you seen out there that a lot of people are facing trying to meet owner requirements?
Government has a lot of agencies, and you would think even so, some of those agencies build similar building types. And we could probably use healthcare for an example. So we have Department of Veterans Affairs. This is, for the veterans. Then we have the military health systems, which is for the active military, and they build the same type facilities, right? And there's been some ongoing efforts to kind of consolidate some of those BIM requirements across both. But when you think about just with our government and healthcare related to our government, those type of facilities, you have multiple people involved. So you've got the VA, which is their own department, but in the Department of Defense, you have medical health systems, and inside of that and projects related to that, you have Army Corps of Engineer projects versus NAVFAC projects. A lot of these facilities do basically the same thing, have the basic same purpose. An exam room is an exam room, right? But they may not all be consistent on their different standards. And so I think one of the challenges for service providers or trades is like you could be working on the same building type, the same type of rooms with the same type of assets. And there's sometimes different set of rules for one versus the other. So, I think the more we can standardize across like agencies like those, like not have different standards for GSA versus Army Corps of Engineers versus NAVFAC, Navy and Marines versus Air Force, the more those things get standardized, it does make it a little easier. But I can tell you it's a real challenge for trades, for service providers, for contractors when there's so much variation. And conversely, when there's not as much variation, for example, like BIM execution plans, which has become very commonplace and most teams do that, the teams get in a flow of being able to produce those things and they're clear and they meet the expectations. When there's a lot of variations in standards, and requirements, that's where I think the teams really struggle. And they struggle because maybe they realize, well, I'm only on this particular project type for 3 or 4 more months. And then I've got a completely different project type, which is, or maybe even it's the same project type, but a different agency that I'm working with and they have a different set of standards. That's a little bit too much of a cognitive load for people who are already focused on doing something else, actually doing the woodworking or actually installing the plumbing or the electrical, right? It's important that we standardize as much as possible, but where the breakdown is when we have too many variations.
Do you think some of the struggles of that is being able to have some consistency from job to job, project to project? Do you think that's could be a contributor to that?
I do think that's a main contributor because, the learning curves are steep for anybody that's busy. Even if the learning content is not that big of a jump, it's still that they're just busy doing other stuff, and having to learn with each project can certainly be a drain. But I got to say, too, I think there has to be a mind shift in our industry a little bit, Robert, too, and I've seen this for so many years, I'm sure you have as well, that stakeholders on projects they really get some concerned with their piece of the pie, right? And they fail to see the big picture of like the entire project or the organization, or they get really concerned with, I hate to say it, but almost like it's not my job, it's not my problem, right? But that's a real issue for our industry because it has domino effects. Like if one trade does that, it affects other trades. If one designer does that, the architect does that, it affects the engineers. Like, so that we're all like in a pond. And the sooner we realize that, we're kind of, a project is like a pond and everything we do or don't do, can have a ripple effect, until we get into that mindset, I don't think we'll reach the optimal outcomes that we could.
Well, I'm about to throw you that curveball because we got to talk about how does contracts affect what you do in a standard, which that's why I was telling you we're on our 5th iteration because guess what? There were some different contractual things that we didn't have in there that we wanted to make sure was part of design criteria, the Division 1 specs, then all the contracts across the board. So how does the not having the contract as part of the standards and those in agreements, how did that affect the enforcement of the day-to-day management of standards?
Yeah, I definitely think it does affect it. Like at the end of the day, we have to have what is required in the contracts, in our specifications, in our drawings. But we also should realize those are the fallbacks, right? That we end up falling back to that. Oftentimes when there's a dispute, sometimes people don't fully read all the specs until there's an issue, and then they actually have to go back and read it. We definitely have to have the teeth to it. We have to have the guardrails on what that means. So it needs to be in our contracts. We also have to think about our delivery method. We've held on to certain delivery methods for a very long time. They've proven to not be the best delivery method. There's pros and cons of each one, but we are an incredibly litigious industry, right? And In the digital age and with all the data, that's just increased, right? It's just another data point. It's another avenue of potential conflict and disagreement because it's no longer just about a building, and now it's about all the information attached to that building and all the assets and the information attached to those assets. So I think there's some delivery methods when it's appropriate fit for the job that we should pursue them, and there's some constraints that we need to get beyond. So you talk to some agencies and say, well, our agency only does one particular type of delivery method. Well, that's an organizational thing. The trades can't do anything about it, right? And the contractors can't do anything about it. But on the organizational level, those organizations should start looking at, are we getting the best outcomes for these delivery types that we're requiring? And if we're not getting the outcomes we want, then why not? When you do that type of analysis and you keep asking why, it's kind of like a 5 why analysis. And you keep asking why, you get to some of these root causes. Sometimes it's lack of contract language. Sometimes it's the project delivery type really kind of created this bit of an adversarial type relationship. So organizations should look at that. I know your audience, a lot of them is owners, and owners should look at that. Like, are we using the right project delivery type for our projects? Is there a better way to do that?
What role do you think our leadership, our VPs, our C-suites, into the enforcement of that, into how we structure that? You think they have a consideration, and also should we involve stakeholders when we're on each of these iterations?
You always got to have the senior leadership aware of what's happening and on board. And really, you always need sponsors, right? So whatever you're doing, you need a sponsor in the organization to do it. So if it is rewriting the manual, it's good for some of the leadership, at least some of the leadership, to know that's what's happening and why it's happening, and then be able to support it. And then also any digital initiative that you have, like if it's anything new, you always need that support. And I would say, you have to have sponsors for each one. And that's typically the leadership that's going to sponsor. They're the ones that's going to say, give you the thumbs up. And they're also going to be the ones that solicit that within the rest of the leadership group. But you also need champions. And those are the people that's all on board to make it happen. They're not necessarily, and they're two different roles, right? Support a sponsor of an initiative versus champions of initiatives, and champions can come from any level in the organization. So I do think that it's important to get stakeholder input. If you're referring to external stakeholders, I'm a big proponent of identifying who your stakeholders are, right? You have key stakeholders, primary, secondary, tertiary stakeholders. You have different stakeholder groups. And I think it's important to identify them because they all need a different message, right? Your senior leadership, your C-suite, they don't need all the details that, the secondary or other primary stakeholders need, the ones who are executing it. They need the high level. That's probably all the time you're going to get is to be able to give that executive summary, the key points about what's happening. A good communication plan understands that there's a lot of different stakeholders with any digital initiative, any digital transformation. There's a lot of different stakeholders. You have a central message that all of them hear, but you have varying levels of details depending on the stakeholder group. And I do think that external stakeholders is an important part of that, right? It's not that the external stakeholders are going to make the decision for you or even strongly sway the decision, but getting their input, getting their feedback, letting them know what you're doing, and then having that pulse check, like, is this fair with the industry? Will likely save an owner some heartache by not just putting something out there and then people aren't delivering, and then you're trying to figure out why, and there's a long discussion about that or even a debate about it. Getting them involved early helps.
It's funny you say that, especially about the leadership track. They're not going to sit there and they're not going to read an 8,200-page document, which comes, you know what I mean? So they're not going to read.
Sorry, did you say 8,200 or 80 to 100?
Just 82, yeah. If that document is that thick for their standard, man, we got a whole different problem. We need to have a different session about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
we can talk offline. I could trim that down for you a little bit. 8,200 pages.
Yeah, but if you have a 100-page document and I'm C-suite, I'm not reading it.
Yeah.
So, but I know that myself, I got to be able to explain what our standards are, what they exist, what they are, why we need it. I need to explain why the change, and that way they understand it and say, you know what, I'm willing to pay for another iteration of a standard. But
Yeah.
that's on us to be able to explain that to them. And a lot of people not understanding. When you're wanting funding, you need to be very clear because that C-suite wants to know what am I getting when I give you this money.
Yeah, right. It's very true. And there's an estimated like 70% of like digital initiatives, change management initiatives fail. And it's generally lack of planning or just not getting the right stakeholders on board with it. And we, as you know, we are an industry that is notorious for chasing shiny objects. And before you know it, we've got an overly complicated tech stack. And we got all these applications that do these little things, but none of it does it fully. And we've actually complicated our problems, not really brought about solutions. So I agree with you. Like being able to make the business case is always critical for why you're changing something. Why this digital initiative? Because if you can't make the business case, how is it going to improve things or make the business better or improve revenue or reduce waste? If you can't make the case for that, then the question is, why are you doing it? Because you're not, it's not a hobby. You're employed there, right? You may really enjoy your job, but you're not just paid to be there and test out, new equipment or new technologies unless you're fully in R&D. But even R&D departments, they have to give something, show something for the investment that's being made, and we always need to be able to make that business case.
Is there a formula to when you should change a standard, when you should revise it, or
Well, I think you need the right structure in place for it. So one of the things that we did as the leadership team when planning for the national BIM standard that took several years to pull together, but I mean, early on we identified we needed a modular approach to it. And the modular approach was intended to allow us to update different portions of it independently of the entire standard because technology emerges really quickly, right? And as fast as it emerges, some of them fall by the wayside pretty quick as well. And then the ones that are good rise to the top. So you don't want to get into this thing where, by the time you publish a standard or even an owner project requirements, by the time you edit it and publish it, it's like there's things that's already out of date. So I think a modular approach is really smart. And I also think, approaching it like with a very agile methodology, understanding that you're able to take those little modules or those pieces and you're able to update them kind of independent of saying, well, here is our 2026 master publication, right? But being able to have these pieces that can be updated independently and reinserted for the next project without having to wait for like a complete overhaul. And then in terms of the content, I do think it's like every project's different. There are things that come along, and I think you have to really you have to, one, every organization should be doing a lessons learned, right? At the end of the project, you should be having some type of reflection that says, these are the things, plus delta, these are the things that work well, these are the things that we need to improve. And then some of those things can be addressed with a standard or owner project requirements, and the things that can be addressed there.
let's say it's a multi-year project and we initiated that standard, we saw a lot of changes. How do we keep that standard relevant though, John?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It is a challenge. Part of it is the structure that, that you have that in your contract language, especially when it's a multi-year project, that some of our digital delivery requirements are subject to change. And then understanding that some of those changes might require some scope adjustment. And, as an owner, you have to account for that. If you trying to implement a change that creates a change on the scope or some of the deliverables for your service providers, then certainly you got to account for that. But build it in the structure, would be the best recommendation I give. Build it in the structure so that the stakeholders that are working with you, service providers, they understand that technology is emerging, and in a 3-year project, a 5-year project, some things are going to change over that time. It's inevitable, and some of those requirements may need adjusting. So I would weave that in as much as possible into the contracts.
I was going to say, is that more contractual versus standards on that part?
Yeah, I would say it's contractual. Then then it's pointing to your standards. But yeah, I think there's certainly ways that you can accommodate for it and not feel like you're locked into. We need to make this change and we can't make this change. Contracts are made to where there can be that type of adjustment and there can be additional compensation if it's warranted. But some changes, are no cost change. They happen all the time in construction, in the actual building. Some changes are like just a no cost change. And as long as the standards are not really increasing the scope or substantially changing the effort to deliver a deliverable, then there shouldn't be an extra charge for it.
So I've sat in Autodesk University with you about standards. I've been to Penn State with you. We've been at MIPS conferences. We've been at a lot of different things about standards, about different versions of standards. We're in March of 2026. What is the one thing that Johnny Fortune would want to fix on the way standards are written today, or where should we start to fix a standard?
Yeah, I feel like my gut is that it is the deliverables being very tight, very clear about what the deliverables are. A lot of times we end up adding, and let me just pause to say, I think you've been stalking me because I have seen you at a lot of conferences and you keep showing up. I don't like I turn around and you're there, but that aside, I would say like tighten up the deliverables. Like don't leave any ambiguity about what a deliverable is. Like tighten those pieces up because a lot of times we put stuff in our standards and it starts, kind of squeaking over into means and methods sometimes. Sometimes it's superfluous language. A standard is not supposed to teach somebody how to do something. It's not training material. And sometimes we let all that stuff in our standards and just creates, it creates more work for us to update all that stuff. But at the heart of it, if we could really tighten up, what are the deliverables? What is exactly what is wanted and needed as a deliverable? Tighten those things up first. That would be the first thing.
So deliverables, standards. Well, hang on. Wait a minute. Did you call me a stalker?
I'm just saying you kind of brought up that you end up in the same place as me, and I always wondered what was going on there. But hey, I'm only kidding. It's always great to see you, buddy.
Yeah, I gotta give you credit, man. I mean, I try to keep people around me who can actually make me think and who can keep my mind going in this fast moving market. As an owner, a lot of people be like, "Man, you got it together." I'm like, "Dude, I wish y'all knew the struggle that I go through." Even don't look at that capital development program. Don't look at the funding. Don't look at when I say we failed and failed and failed because it's hard, Johnny.
Yeah.
Being able to have multi-year projects and some fast projects, some that are a little bit slow. So sometimes it's a struggle trying to enforce something. So what kind of advice can you give somebody like myself who may have various type of projects, landside, airside, various terminals, various different things? What kind of advice can you give me for some of the struggles of enforcing a standard?
Well, I think on a very positive note, the fact that there are struggles means you are pushing the needle, right? If there would be no struggles if the status quo was just completely acceptable, right? And you just did the same thing you've done for the last 30 years, the struggles are a really good indicator that you're trying to make progress. And so that's a really good thing. And anytime you're trying to make progress and anytime that you're trying to, invoke change and innovation, it's going to come with a struggle. It's reinforcing the idea that you're pioneering, you're trailblazing, you're trying to move things forward. I think the second reminder is that, and again, this is very dear to me because I've spent a lot of my time doing this type of work and studying this field is performance improvement. There's always room for improvement. And that's not to say that something has failed or that it's wrong. And I do think there's a different way of looking at failure as well. I think one of the NFL coaches, I think, said this, it was in the playoffs this past year, said, "We don't lose, we learn," which is a great way to look at it, right? Is like everything that we think is a failure, everything that we think is a loss is really an opportunity for us to learn and improve. And when I talk about performance improvement, it's not that like things are completely broken and we need to uphaul. There's always room to improve the performance. And sometimes, assessing where you're at in performance really opens up opportunities. Not that it was broken and not that there was actually even something you would consider was a need, but all of a sudden you see, hey, here's an opportunity. I want to seize that opportunity. And it does feel like it's often an uphill push, to be able to seize the opportunity. So I guess to sum it up, my advice is look at it differently. It's actually a positive. The struggles means that you are innovating, you are changing, you are improving. And then every failure or every loss is really a stepping stone. It's an opportunity to learn. And we're on a journey. like never get to the destination of where, okay, everything's running perfectly smooth now and we don't have to change anything, right? It's we're on a journey, and we taking joy in the journey of continual improvement, is going to bring a lot more happiness than trying to take happiness or draw happiness from a destination.
How can people get in touch with you? How can they find your podcast? How can they keep up with the Johnny Fortune, who I look up to and who's one of my go-to guys in this industry?
It's very kind of you. I think one of the easiest ways for people to remember is just find me on LinkedIn. And then my company is AECO Digitech. So, if you can go to AECOdigitech.com, it's got information on there. It's also a page on LinkedIn. You can find information about our podcast. And I'll be happy to connect with some of your audience, and always look forward to the opportunity to talk with you more, Robert. And definitely, now that this is being recorded and this would go on record, I want to get a commitment out of you coming and joining my podcast.
Man, I'm not going to say nothing to you. Come on. That wraps up today's discussion on the purpose and power of owner standards. When standards are clear, enforced, and connected to real operational needs, they become one of the strongest tools an owner has. Thanks for spending time with us on the Digital Exchange. More conversations ahead. Until then, keep building smarter. Dr. Johnny Fortune. This first time I ever called you that?
I know I didn't notice, but thank you.
I just thought first time I ever called you that.
Well, was it difficult? That's the question. Was it difficult out of the words?
We got to talk about that later, because that was an event in saying Dr. Johnny Fortune. I just know it's Johnny. Johnny, I got questions, man. I got questions.
I got answers, but they may not be right. So
I know you got a podcast. I listened to it, and see, here you go, thinking I'm a stalker again.
No, I'm going to have you on. Like, you need to come, and then we'll switch seats.
I want to make sure that they know that you are available to write standards. It ain't free.
Right.
So don't email and think it's free. But if you need somebody who you need to come in and write standards, kind of see where your program is, Johnny's company is able to do that. So
absolutely happy to help. My vision for the industry is helping to advance the industry. Sometimes that means doing it one organization at a time. Definitely, I'm passionate about that. That's what drives me, is to help organizations, like help them improve in the areas they want to improve and see tangible outcomes. Happy to consult folks. Reach out. Glad to have a conversation with you.